Welcome back to Book Club. Well, I apologize for the low lighting for today's video. We are getting the sort of fallout from the hurricane that's going through the American South states right now. And so it is kind of dark and gloomy in here, and the artificial light is just not enough to make up for the absence of daylight. Also, it's rather chilly. It's in the mid-50s today, and it was close to 80 earlier this week. So, go figure. Well, today we are going to wrap up Persuasion and get started on A Confederacy of Dances. All right, when we come back. So, we start in on the second half of Persuasion, and we pick up just as the party at Upper Cross is about to go to Lyme. So Lyme is a seaside community, which would have been a small town at the time, and certainly even smaller in the off season, because this is taking place in the autumn. You're getting close to wintertime. In fact, Anne doesn't leave for Bath until Christmas, so we're getting into the end of the year. So the party at Upper Cross consists of Anne, her sister Mary, Mary's husband Charles, Charles's two sisters, Louisa and Henrietta, and Captain Wentworth. They all go to Lyme to visit Captain Wentworth's friends and comrades, Captains Harville and Bennick. Now, Captain Bennick's name is pronounced that way. The W is silent. He has been recently bereft. His fiancée, Captain Harville's sister, had died. And mind you, we're not yet at the end of the year. The young woman died in the summer. Bennick didn't hear about it until August, so it's a reasonably fresh death, at least in his mind. So a raw wound. And Anne spends her time at Lyme consoling and attempting to bolster his spirits. And I should probably throw this in. They mention a Byron poem and how to properly pronounce the name of it. Jower. It is pronounced Jower. It rhymes with flower. Okay? That's Giaour, I think. I will put the spelling up for you. And yes, it was a difficult to pronounce word. So, that was just a quick little aside. Louisa Musgrove has an accident brought on by her own inexplicably willful, inexplicable isn't, we do have an explanation for why Louisa was so willful, but we'll get to that later. But her willful desire to jump down the steps, and that she should jump and Captain Wentworth should catch her, and this is just great fun. And it's important to remember she's just a teenage girl. She has an accident. She remains in Lyme. Anne returns to Upper Cross, spends the rest of the year with Lady Russell, and returns to Bath. Well, no, actually, she doesn't return to Bath. She goes to Bath and joins her family. Now, there was a chance meeting at Lyme with Mr. Elliot, who becomes important when we get to Bath. The general supposition with Mr. Elliot, who is the heir of Sir Walter's baronetcy, is that he is courting Elizabeth. that if that ever actually existed as a reality in the minds of anyone but Elizabeth and Mrs. Clay, it certainly passes away as soon as he sees Anne again. Anne is the one he's taken with. And then Mr. Elliot begins courting Anne. Meanwhile, Captain Wentworth has become aware of the fact that he has entangled himself with Louisa Musgrove, that he has clearly led her on. That's the term Wood would use. Led her to believe that his interest in her was serious. So he needs to get himself out of that entanglement, and he has discovered that he has feelings for Anne. So in comes Captain Benwick, and Captain Benwick becomes infatuated with Louisa. They marry. Louisa's, whatever her infatuation is with Captain Wentworth, transfers over to Benwick. All of these things are perfectly normal and reasonable. Benwick has just lost his fiancée. He's looking for an emotional attachment. And at first it's Anne, later it's Louisa. Louisa is a 17-year-old girl who is looking for some man to fall in love with. And it's Captain Wentworth, and soon it's Captain Benwick. And, if a third person had come along, that'd probably be who it was. Nothing extraordinarily odd or unusual about any of this. Anne does not wish to marry Mr. Elliot. She finds that he has a character that's too reserved. He used to do Sunday traveling. So clearly he had some moral problems. I mean, traveling on a Sunday? Good heavens, the man is just an irremediable reprobate. Anyway, her friend, Mrs. Smith, who is an old school friend with whom she has become reacquainted while she's at Bath, eventually comes to tell her of Mr. Elliot's former life, which was apparently pretty bad, and his schemes, and his primary interest being to separate Mrs. Clay from Sir Walter, because another marriage could produce an heir that would cut Mr. Elliot out of the baronetcy. So Captain Wentworth eventually arrives at Bath, and he and Anne are reunited, and everybody gets to live happily ever after. The end. So that's our plot in a nutshell, but there's so much more to it than that. As I've mentioned right along, Persuasion contains the most highly developed of Jane Austen's literary creations. One of the reasons that I think Persuasion and Northanger Abbey are such good companions is we see a lot of issues raised in Northanger Abbey. It's a question that's thrown out there, and these questions are answered in Persuasion. At one point in Northanger Abbey, when Catherine is thinking about the Gothic novels that she has read, she is reminded that Mr. Allen, remember, a man of good sense, had made fun of the fact that the characters were drawn in such black and white terms, all good, all evil. Those that were not as good as an angel were as evil as a demon. So in Persuasion, we see the full range of human foibles. No one is really good. No one is really bad. And the theme running through it, of course, is a persuadability of temperament. And Austen was too good a writer for any of this to be accident. When you can draw these things out, it's not because I'm reading something into it. No. What I read into it is what she wrote into it, because her genius, well, there were a couple of geniuses that she had. One was her very sharp wit, and that cannot be undervalued. But another of her great geniuses was her knowledge of human character. Long before there was any such thing as psychology, Jane Austen was a brilliant delineator of the human condition. And we can pull her works one after another apart and take a look at the things we take for granted today that she was the one to first really exemplify in her works. But we're not going to do that. We're just going to talk about the characters in Persuasion. So when we look at the characters, Austen, as I already mentioned, tells us that Mary has great good nature when she's getting her own way, because Mary loves to get her own way. Now, the way Mary does it is with sulks and temper tantrums and hypochondria. And Louisa Musgrove, of course, is determined to get her own way too. And this was probably always a tendency, because I think what Austen is telling us is everybody likes to have their own way. Everybody wants to do what they want to do. But Louisa, as a young girl of 17, a teenager, Louisa has been receiving the approbation from Captain Wentworth, who is actively not only encouraging her to be headstrong, but telling her she ought to do her best to make her sister headstrong too. Now, to do Captain Wentworth justice, there can be no way that he thinks that's what he's saying. But it is what he's saying when he speaks of firmness of character to a young girl. The only possible interpretation is, oh, I guess it's a good idea that I should trench and stamp my feet and do what I want. And this results in Louisa's accident. And apparently at this point, this is when Captain Wentworth actually comes to realize that there is a difference between a too easily persuadable nature and a nature that is open to reasonable and sensible influence. Louisa demanding to be jumped down those steps, and even in spite of everyone's protests and suffering the consequences, is a sharp contrast to Anne's actions when she gave up her engagement 8 years earlier, under more reasonable persuasion from people she ought to have been respecting at the very least. I'm not going to say people whose advice she should have been taking, but people whose opinions required respect. So Louisa, who is clearly a good person, she's a happy, lively young girl, trenches in, becomes stubborn, very nearly kills herself, and certainly causes no end of distress for those who love her. We see other instances of people determined to go their own way. And Mrs. Clay, who is scheming to get Sir Walter to marry her. Mr. Elliot, who is scheming to get back into the family so that he can prevent it. Those are two people who get what they want through manipulation, through subterfuge. And we also have Sir Walter, Elizabeth, Lady Russell, people who get their own way simply by being immovable objects. These are my opinions. That's the end of the story. So we see that whole broad range. In the second part of the book, we start to see that although Lady Russell is held up to us as a very good woman, we see some touches that are not so good. For example, when she learns that Captain Wentworth is involved with Louisa Musgrove, she takes a sort of vindictive delight in this. It validated her early opinions of him as being worthless, and she's pleased by this, which, although are perfectly understandable human sentiments, are hardly laudable. Later, when she and Anne are in the carriage riding down the street and she sees Captain Wentworth, she makes up some ridiculous story about looking at somebody's window curtains instead. So we see again, honesty is failing her, candor is failing her, and she is making up a foolish story rather than say, I thought I saw somebody I knew. Another one of our characters that's held up as a very good woman is Mrs. Smith. And this is a character that has always troubled me because Mrs. Smith is alleged to be Anne's friend. And yet, when she thinks that Anne is going to marry Mr. Elliot, she's willing to keep her mouth shut. Well, actually, she's not just willing to keep her mouth shut about what she knows. She actually says, let me advocate on behalf of my former friend. Where can you find a better marriage? Where can you go to make everyone around you happier than this particular man? She actually pushes the match because she has her own designs. It is only after Anne absolutely assures her that there is no possibility of a marriage that she speaks out. Now, I personally have to say, I do not find those to be the actions of a good friend. I think if you believe somebody is truly evil and your friend is involved with them, you have an obligation to speak out. Now, Mrs. Smith is going to get what she wants because she believes that Anne is going to marry Mr. Elliot and she can use that influence. It's fine with her if that's what happens. And there's almost a sense that as long as she gets what she wants, she doesn't care what she helps to set her friend Anne up for, which could be a miserable, miserable marriage. And of course, it's with Mrs. Smith that we see some problems in Anne's character, too. Yes. Mrs. Smith hands Anne a bunch of correspondence between Mr. Elliot and Mrs. Smith's late husband. Now, to us, that probably doesn't sound like a big deal. But at the time, reading other people's correspondence was unacceptable. Keep in mind, this was in the days before any sort of communication beyond face-to-face chatting or a letter. So to us, it would be like eavesdropping on someone's phone call. And in fact, with federal wiretaps, we're becoming very inured to that. It's a complete violation of privacy. And even Austen says that Anne, in reading the letters, knows that it's a breach of honor to do this. Oh, this was way more than a breach of honor. Mrs. Smith never should have given up the correspondence in the first place. These were private letters. Anne shouldn't have read them. But we know that Mrs. Smith is also a gossip. We know that based on her relationship with Nurse Rook, who brings her all the gossip. And gossip today is considered relatively harmless. In those days, it was a much, much more serious offense to be a gossip. In fact, in colonial America, in New England, there were laws against it. Seriously, gossiping was a criminal offense. So that's the context in which we're looking at this. So we're seeing that even Anne's hands are not clean. And Anne, of course, uh, won't blame herself for being persuaded to give up her engagement. She won't blame Lady Russell. Okay, so I guess then who's to blame? Anne behaved badly. She accepted a man's offer of marriage, then broke the marriage off, and that was quite a big deal. It's called breach of promise, and that was not a criminal offense. It was a civil offense. So breach of promise was no small thing either. Yet she takes no blame onto herself for this. Hard to reconcile that with the character of a good woman. Captain Wentworth, he's led two women on, two sisters on, primarily to spite Anne. Now, Austen does not tell us that's what he's doing, but she puts the facts out there, and I think we are to determine that ourselves. Why would they be two women within Anne's own family, if not, to just sort of say, hey, somebody else wants me, babe? Again, perfectly reasonable human foibles. We're not talking about, pushing orphans off a cliff or anything, just human foibles. And this brings me to something. I'm going to call these Easter eggs because I don't know what else to call them. Although the term Easter egg came out in my lifetime, meaning a little something hidden in a video game that you find. In this case, it's a little something dropped in the novel and nothing is made of after that. There are two interesting little lines in the book that tell us Captain Wentworth never stopped loving Anne. You don't catch it the first read through, but you do on a second read through. When Austen tells us about Captain Wentworth's original plans in going to Kellynch, going to Uppercross, she says originally he was going to see his sister and his brother-in-law. He paid a call in Uppercross, and his intent originally had been to travel on to the brother, the clergyman who had just recently married. But he was too well satisfied with what was going on in Uppercross to go on to visit his brother. And Austen says, well, he had the attentions of these young girls. No, that's not it. And we know it, and we know Austen knows it, because later, when Charles and Mary are talking to Lady Russell about Captain Benwick, I think that's where it takes place. Captain Benwick was going to pay a call in Uppercross, hopefully to see Anne. That's what he wanted to do. And he was under the mistaken impression that she would have been staying in the Musgrove family, whereas she was instead at Kellynch with Lady Russell. So his spirit fails him and he doesn't go. In another conversation with Captain Wentworth, we find that when he was going away to see his brother, when he was leaving Lyme to get away from Louisa in the hopes that her attachment would fade, he attempted to persuade Captain Benwick to join him. I find that one word alone tells us to pay attention, because he was clearly as aware as everyone else that Captain Benwick was becoming infatuated with Anne and did not want him to go to Uppercross. He wanted to take him out of the picture. So it's very interesting the way knowing what has transpired sort of alters our impression of those two tiny little lines that were dropped in a couple of different places in the book. So that is my take on Northanger Abbey. Again, my take alone. So give me your opinions. Now, we get on to A Confederacy of Dances, and I think the timing is good on this because I'm hearing that we are likely to go back into lockdown in some, if not most, of the country soon. I don't know whether this is true. This is just what I'm hearing. If it does happen, it's just as well that we have something entertaining to read. So let me give you a little bit of background on this. The author, John Kennedy Toole, wrote this. He wrote a novel when he was a teenager. I usually refer to this as the only novel he ever wrote because he was 16 when he wrote the other one, and he did not consider it anything more than a juvenile writing exercise. But he committed suicide at the age of 31. It seems to be largely out of depression through his inability to get this published. And his mother then sent it from one publisher to another. Now, mind you, he had sent it to publishers. Then his mother did it after his death. It was not actually published until 1980, I think. And it was written in the late 60s. So she spent at least 10 years. And eventually did get someone to read it. That was all she had to do, just get someone to read it. Now, Toole himself had gotten someone to read it. That publisher, that was at Simon & Schuster, they said it was a very funny book, but it seemed rather pointless. The problem is that when you talk about a book like this being rather pointless, it is an opinion coming from another era. By the late 60s, this sort of slice of life comedy was just beginning to be recognized as a nice, a literary style, a real literary style. And people were just beginning to realize that you don't have to make an earth-shattering point. You don't need a world-changing message. A book can stand on its own merits, and this one does. It got a Pulitzer Prize, so that's not just my personal opinion. There is no question that this is a great book. Winner of the Pulitzer Prize. It is so funny. I think the reason more people haven't heard of the book is it was written in the 60s and has a very 60s mentality. Very sort of upsetting the status quo. But it was published in the 80s when we were just devotedly wedded to the status quo. I think if the book had been published in its own time, it would have been, it would have been its own version of Catcher in the Rye. It would have been something that just so resonated, because the generation it resonates with is a generation that has seen the 60s. But I attribute the late publication date, well, not necessarily late, let me take that back. I attribute the fact that it was published in 1980, as opposed to many, many other decades in which it might have been published. I attribute that to the lack of awareness people have of it, simply because we were going from such a revolutionary decade, the 60s, into such a closed-off conservative decade like the 80s. Maybe another decade and it would have fared better. But it is screamingly funny. This is a book that is just, you just have to put it down and walk away and wait until your eyes are no longer watering from laughter to come back and read it again. So, how about we take a look at this, and given the fact that these are longer chapters, you want to take the first 5 chapters. We will go through this, and that will put us up to page 128. So as you can see, Austen had much shorter chapters. I'll try taking the first 5. Why don't we do this? I will once again publish the link where you can download a PDF copy of this book. I got this copy quite recently, a few weeks ago, on Amazon. It was, I think, $11, including shipping. But as you can see, I was kind of picky and demanded a very good copy. You can get copies for under $10, including shipping. But again, giving you a link because I don't want any of you to have to spend any money on whatever it is we're going to read. Just go download it. You can read it on your tablet, on your smartphone, on your computer, on whatever, because it will be a PDF copy. A PDF copy means you can read it on your Kindle or any of your little book reading devices. All right. I will talk to you all later. We are starting this. I always have a hard time. I have to take breaks from it because, as I say, it's just so screamingly funny. All right. And we will see you back here next Thursday when we will talk about a Confederacy of Dances.